An atomic concept is the simplest unit of meaning which a given word has. By simple, we don't mean a lack of complexity or ease of comprehension, but simple in a technical way. Let's take an example. In geometry, you're told, there is a certain figure. This figure is described as a simple, non-self-intersecting, closed planar figure with exactly 3 vertices. The interior angles of this figure sum up to exactly 180 degrees. The figure is the polygon with the smallest possible number of sides in Euclidean space. As in, you can't make a polygon with fewer than 3 straight segments. The figure is the only polygon that is inherently rigid. Fixing side lengths fixes the shape completely, i.e., no floppy joints without changing side lengths. There exists exactly 1 circle that passes through all vertices of the figure. Every vertex is connected to exactly 2 other vertices by straight line segments. Your immediate impression would be, this is a triangle. You may have inferred this from the simple, reducible fact that this figure, as described, possesses the minimal polygonal form possible in Euclidean space, i.e., from the numerous descriptive examples, you have deduced a fact simple enough as to include all of them. You have performed a reduction of a collection of statements to the simplest possible explanation that satisfies all the conditions. If you were to put it in formal and, as it were, cerebral terms, your mind would have processed it this way. X has property M, where M of Y, if and only if Y, is simple closed polygon and Y has fewer vertices than any other simple closed polygon in Euclidean space. The intuition of minimal polygonality is what all the facts are ultimately subordinate to. It's something that, being so simple in the geometrical sense, is subject, as we see, to the widest scope of derivable facts. Yet the core remains simple. This is a key feature of atomic concepts. They are often subtle and difficult to get to. So much has to be scraped off the surface before the core can be obtained. But when we do obtain this core, we realize that it suddenly makes up everything, that we can find it in everything, that it's implied by everything, that from it, everything can be constructed by addition of complexity. This is a bit of a hyperbole, but it paints the picture clearly. In Husserl's phenomenology, this is called eidetic reduction. If you perform eidetic reduction on a triangle, you don't care about this or that drawn triangle, but about the essence of triangle, triangleness, a 3-sided polygon with certain necessary relations. You're seen through the penumbra of facts to the underlying invariant component. Because you know that the facts change, a triangle varies in shape, in the circumstances of its use, in the conditions of its construction, its import, but something remains. This is the atomic concept. It's what we aim at unconsciously when attempting to understand anything. But you shouldn't understand the atomic concept as vaguely as an essence or a core, but rather technically, as a function. For the atomic concept, though subtle, is never hidden. It's just our impression of it, as something that appears behind the more immediate array of observable facts. In reality, it's the most blatant of the facts, at least when understood. Because what's immediately observable changes, but the atomic concept is what remains through this process of change. Atomic concepts are not content words, they are function words. The distinction is very important. The triangle can only be thought in its simplicity if it can be constructed. The function here is the assembly of attributes in the expression of an aspect of triangularity. Hence the notion of the concept of measure, which we discussed in the last video. How is triangle a function word? Well, beyond the content which we automatically come to associate it with, it is first and foremost an artifact by which certain characteristics of specifically technical interest are instantiated. In other words, think of it exactly as the geometer or mathematician does, not in a philosopher's sense as we're usually prone to do. This is what we did in the formal description of the triangle in the beginning. Content words, or lexical words, carry the main meaning of a sentence. They typically include nouns, main verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and such. While function words, otherwise known as structure words or grammatical words, serve a grammatical or structural purpose, not a lexical meaning. They typically include articles, pronouns, prepossessions, conjunctions, auxiliary verbs, determiners, and such. You can see that function words are operational, technical in their use. We learn to use function words. On the other hand, we learn the meaning of content words. Or more accurately, we're told. If you think about it, fluency and eloquence in language is less the effect of content words than the free and dexterous handling of function words. They encode the geometry of meaning, as it were. They're the meaning-making aspect of meaning. In keeping with our introductory definition of the atomic concept, syllables, phonemes, morphemes that make up content words are themselves function words, coefficients that are otherwise absorbed in the content word. The simplicity is eventually substituted for a more intuitive usage. The function becomes only an expedient by which the intuitive content word is generated. But in applied sciences, the direction is reversed. Evidence for this is found in scientific nomenclature, how chemists and biologists, in naming phenomena, borrow and string together syllables and phonemes from Latin. The alphabet is a standard model of function words. In them operates that same mechanism as the variables of mathematical physics. But this requires that we hone in on the relation between lexical or content word meaning and function word meaning, or as we called it, meaning making. We mentioned that among the function words are articles and prepossessions, and saw in the last video how the definite article in a particular language is this principle of concept formation. In the Quran, this is treated at the same level of cognizance as a scientific linguist confronts the function word. There's a dialectic between content and function words here, that although the two are distinct, they complement and qualify one another. A function word becomes contentful when its functionality is distinguished. And by the same token, a content word has content only because it's functional. This is what decides when and where to use the word and when and where not to use it. Now we see that what clearly determines meaning is manner of use, which is simply function, which is the logical signature of the definite article. This can be said about anything that has what we vaguely call meaning, the safest linguistic generalization, if you will. We realize something here. If we approach meanings as analyses of different functions, then the requisite for distinguishing functions becomes strictly empirical. For to be acquainted with the manner of use requires that we study the various cases of use, to view conditions of use. Here, even if you're naively sure about the meaning of a word, a functional analysis will reveal to us important nuances and subtleties which the usual automatic content use of the term veils from us. We suddenly begin to use content words as function words, and this line of reasoning inevitably leads to poetry. On the contrary, when function words are used as content words, it leads to something like metaphysics or physics. Think of the etymology of the word energy, a composite of the syllables en, which means within, and ergon, a content word that denotes work. Think here of the function which words like in, or f, from, without, within, inside, into, around, among, at, and other such words have. Here we see how visual and tactile they are. Now if you take them in their simplicity as deictic terms and reflect upon the syllables of which they are composed, you realize that there isn't a word in the general corpus of at least commonly used words that does not contain one of them or isn't modified by one of them. For instance, the word ground contains the mediating syllable oun, which we find in the prepossession about or around. The same goes for sound or found. Now, given enough cases, we come to see the syllable oun as a standalone functional device. Think of announce, bound, council, county, country, doubt, ounce. Very prevalent, isn't it? So prevalent, you think it's a word all to itself, but it's just a prepossession, a sort of device that we use around words. But in this analytic method we're following, it's to be treated as a word all to itself, an atomic word. The modification it offers and the rules by which it operates are gleaned from the diversity of applications. Observe all the words in which it occurs, and eventually you will begin to register a certain sense. It may be a pitch, a sensibility, an image, or a movement of sorts. Too vague and elusive to be captured as a content word, but also too important and articulate to be dismissed as its opposite. It strikes a midpoint where its utility is realized in the connective and emotive rendering it serves. This syllable conveys for me a kind of magnitude, but in the immediate sense, a depth factor that is latent in some object. The volume of some object precedes our conception of this object, such that, in my conception of ground or ounce, I'm immediately bound by whatever depth it already holds within itself. It's a sense of being engulfed, enveloped, surrounded. The volume is the inner being or the ergon of the concept itself, not volume in the measurable or quantitative sense. When you've successfully isolated this sense impression from the various cases of use, you can reapply it to find how this sense impression qualifies those same words according to their respective domains. For sound, it gives us that distinctly acoustic depth, that inward or interior pervasion of tone, or as Spangler so aptly put it, a tone world. For ground, the depth factor affects our spatial sense, dimensionality perhaps. The same goes for round, which is a more radical expression of that intuition of space, capturing not so much the specific finished geometrical object, but its animation, a roundabout motion, a surrounding activity. Function words in general serve that same function, and we choose to include them in our description of atomic concepts because those concepts operate in that same subtle way. And if we can bring our understanding to grow accustomed to isolating them, we will be able to understand much of the import of Quranic words. Atomic concepts, if we can describe them in the simplest terms, strike us as reflexive, vital, in Bergson's sense, or as an expressive movement in Darwin's sense. Psychologist Wundt writes that the arms and hands, as the organs through which we grasp and master objects, are only superior in humans compared to higher animals in degree, not in kind. Adding that, in humans, what results is a gradual transformation, which at first appears regressive, but which leads to the first primitive form of pantomimic movement, which he describes as a grasping movement attenuated to an indicative gesture. A great approximation of this is found in the example which Lotze gives, of how what we call our bodies may include things not immediately in contact with us. For example, my home, car, company, possessions, even something as abstract as a persuasion, which he says become extensions of my own physical body, such that damage to them is, in Samuel Alexander's words, like a blow in the face. Now this grasping function, which Wooden says varies in degree, and which results, as we see in Lotz's case, in possessiveness, or the possessiveness of non-physical things, is a great example of the import of atomic concepts. This is the same functionality which the prepositional syllable aun encodes to sound and spatial objects, as we saw. We now see how this grasping function is operative not only in the physical clutching activity, but also in something like the acquisition of assets. Likewise, one's personality in relation to something like corporate personhood. The scope of the activity does not at all affect the import and utility of the function, and this is to be understood as one of the peculiarity, if not the main peculiarity, of atomic concepts. This is a central idea in scientific nomenclature, the metaphysical part, if you will. Think about the word mass and how it made its way into modern scientific terminology. This introduction was officially made by Newton, where the word appears in its Latin form massa.
Quantitas materiae est mensura ejus dem orta ex ilius densitate and magnitudine conjunctim, hanc autem quantitatem sub nomine corporis vel massae insequentibus. Or, if you prefer, the quantity of matter is a measure of the same arising from its density and magnitude together. This quantity, however, I refer to under the name of body or mass in what follows. I needed a name for that binding somewhat, that property of things which the Latin and Greek thought of under the name massae. Thus, should my physical employment of this concept elude you, just think of its original Latin and Greek sense, then carefully observe how that sense changes as the context changes to that of physics. It was important that I learn how the expression massa was used back in those days, though the form in which I was to use it was going to be quite different, quadratic. The more examples I chased of this word, the more I realized that in all of these cases something is preserved and reappears, albeit in a different sense each time. A sense, a thought, an idea. And to give this sense a word, I thought, would defeat the point. It would dilute it, dampen its luster. In Latin, the term appears across many contexts, notably in political settings. I learned about the Roman governor Baebius Massa through the writings of Pliny the Younger and Tacitus. The cognomen Massa is quite significant here, for it seemed to describe him as the word heavy may describe a block of basalt, or green, a foliage of leaves, or black, the fur of a panther. I learned that Baebius Massa was a governor who became infamous for plundering the provinces he administered, enriching himself at the expense of the locals. Pliny and Tacitus waste no opportunity to paint him as a symbol of official greed. My research also showed me that the expression massa was used in legal and political contexts in a similar sense, to refer to legal precedents, to legal cases that form precedents, to the notion of binding authority, to the accumulation of something, or to something that's cumulative in nature. Cicero employs the term in a similar vein, something like institutional weight or bearing. It was often used interchangeably with words like consolidation, aggrandizement, and assimilation, whether of wealth, power, or anything that can be scaled. The cognomen massa would have seemed to the Roman intellectual an appropriate moniker for Baebius, for this function was quite popular as a governing methodology, especially by the likes of him. In the political language of your day, dear listener, terms like agglomerate or corporate are perhaps more familiar. That is, if by these you're made to think of some predatory upper stratum of society. If not, then whatever the equivalent term with the same characteristics may be. Pharaoh in the Quran was quite explicitly described this way. Think the expression, Pharaoh of the vast dominion. Pardon my translation. for I here understood the Arabic manika dhul utad, by analogy to the title of a work by John Selden, a famous writer in my days, called Of the Dominion, which conveys a similar theme, a domineering, enterprising power. Ovid uses the expression in a cosmological setting, in connection with primordial chaos. He says, Cum quae pressa diu massa latuere sub illa, sidera coeperunt toto effervescere caelo. When the stars, which had long lain hidden beneath that compressed mass, began to effervesce throughout the entire heaven. He uses it elsewhere in its original culinary sense. Lactis massa coacti, mass of curdled milk or cheese, in the humble meal served by Baucis and Philemon. In another setting, he uses it in an alchemical context, and you know how much I love alchemy. Contactu glaiba potenti massa fit. By powerful touch the clod becomes a mass, describing Midas's golden touch transforming matter. In a material or physical sense, tanta mali moles tantoque potentio arte est. So great is the mass of evil and stronger than any skill. Note here how the word is not just referenced or used, it actively shapes what follows it, shapes the context, shapes the grammar, the wording, the phrasing of what immediately follows. That is because it is truly the centre of that part of the verse, the propositional nexus, what Ovid was moulding, but what he could only express by the medium of other words. In your time, you would recognise it as gluten, or as a gluten-like substance, something with a binding property. This gluten of yours would be thought of as something that binds water and creates structural networks in dough, essentially what makes bread hold itself together when oven heat causes it to change form. Gluten proteins, as you call them in your time, gliadine and glutenin, form extensive hydrogen bonds with water, creating a hydrated protein matrix. This is what gives bread its chewy texture and holds the dough together in the way we're familiar with. What's interesting is the sameness of function, though 3 centuries stand between us. For I read that you too conceive of this structural bond as stable under variation, meaning the composition is subject to as many configurational and compositional varieties without that essential bond being broken, which is precisely the sense I had in mind when I finally decided to employ the concept mass in my second law of motion.
This word seems to have come from the Greek word maza, meaning barley cake or lump of dough. Newton defines this term in his physics as a quantity of matter arising from its density and bulk conjointly. Is this really a play of words, a neologism, or is there a deeper motive or logic that's operative in what seems at first a merely emblematic and convenient choice of words? To answer this most effectively, we'd have to examine the various cases wherein this term indirectly appears as a constituent, or a syllable, or a connective. We find in Greek the following terms. From these various examples, we get the sense that mass largely connotes an activity describable as synthesis, or agglomeration, or a heap or collection of things held together into synthetic unity. The distinction between content and lexical terms is highly important. We need to be aware of the difference in order to be able to perform the abstraction which a deeper understanding of any concept requires. The transformation of the content word into a function word is necessary for the purpose not only of generalization, i.e. inductive inference, but also of specification, or deductive inference. Remember what we said above about fluency and eloquence? That they're less the effect of content words than the free and dexterous handling of function words. Now think semantic felicity. How do we express an idea in such a way that if it were expressed any differently, would result in a completely different idea? The idea here is to extend the range of word functionality to include the principle of sufficient reason. Think the principle of least action, but for language. This suggests that a given concept or idea, which typically a content word captures, is a sort of law or principle with which we're first acquainted before we can even think of naming. I know exactly what I want to say, but I don't have the words to express it. See here that the effort of capturing this word is as agglomerating, as enterprising as the expression massa connotes, such that even if we fail to produce an expression that exactly mirrors it, the collection of words which we subordinate to it becomes symbolic, or rather symptomatic of it. We're willing to subordinate the whole of language to the effort of grasping it. This idea that we vividly understand but find it difficult to express is still in the domain of what we call intuition. We seek to tame and capture it using a word, and subsequently, the wording act transforms it into a content word. It's here where the intuitive, vivid meaning is lost and buried beneath what would become a mechanical and habitual nomenclature. This is what we often try to restore when reading contemplatively. When reading poetry or certain novels, or even painting or music. The aesthesis that colors any artistic production is really the pulsation of that underlying concept which we call atomic. It's also the proper object of Socrates' dialectical method of midwifery, the notion to be drawn. Think about how we use prepossessions, the purposiveness with which we employ them in sentences. We don't necessarily think of the expression above as a shorthand for some more precise term. We're perfectly aware of its mere functionality, of the spatial intuition which it gives. There's a difference in sense between the expression ground and ground with the syllable ound distinguished in it. This is what we meant by function words as coefficients. The depth or magnitude gleaned structurally converts a mere surface to a dimension, something extant or measurable, in a more immediate sense than would our understanding find in just ground. It becomes something like surface times depth equals dimensional, by contrast to sound, where we get noise times depth equals acoustic. Now, if you've grasped the main idea of the atomic concept, then you should understand what's meant when we say that the Quran is a compendium of atomic terms. Thus, what we need is something akin to a complex number to unlock for us that extra semantic dimension. Let's simplify our definition to say that the words of the Quran are the kinds of words, the understanding of which demands that same inductive approach we apply to the word mass. The meaning of the term can only be obtained when we analyze it. It must be analyzed until we've obtained that vivid, intuitive sense impression which, under normal circumstances, we know only intuitively, but don't necessarily have the right words in which to put it. This means that we must adopt a pragmatist approach. It's noteworthy to mention here the fact that pragmatism was an idea developed by C.S. Peirce, founder of semiotics. If we said that the atomic concept is a normal word, but a word whose meaning depends entirely on the way it's used, then we'd be leaning towards or adopting a semiotic approach. For under normal circumstances, we don't really interpret words but directly use or employ them. And this is a point worth highlighting because it shows that our language use is primarily functional. Our tendency to not reflect deeply on the meaning of words but instead take them for what they commonly imply, though naive, is itself evidence for the general functional tendency of language. We want to know what a word means in order to use it. And in most cases, we want to use them in the best way possible. But the problem is whether we've understood a term deeply enough as to know how it should be used. We must take this general functional tendency as an indication of an innately felicitous disposition in language itself, that the word captures some sense or meaning that is wanting of expression, even if the expression given to it is erroneous. Professor Baldwin defines implication as the meaning by which belief, the attitude of acknowledgement and judgment, is rendered. If meaning-making is the essential function of a word, then implication is the effect of a meaningful word. And this is typically where the analysis of a word, or the linguisticality of normal language use, stops. For we usually want to know what the interlocutor intends to say. We see no need to go beyond semantics here. The tendency which gives us the atomic concept is opposite to this. We want to reverse the process of implication, call it explication, and reach the ethos, or essence of the word, that essential thought for the sake of which the utterance or the word was made. The spellbinding effect of implication really originally belongs to the atomic concept, because when we know what we want to say, but can't find the words to say it, as we said earlier, we're truly experiencing what's called implication, a process which in normal circumstances is transient and would lead us to some other associated idea. That dark cloud should evoke rain as a subsequent judgment is indeed implicational, but inasmuch as that aporia we typically reach when we suddenly lack the language tools to give something a more precise definition. This is what an aporia is. The failure of some meaningful idea to find a proper host, though contradictory and, properly speaking, aporetic, is actually a good thing, for here, more than anywhere, it shows the purity and stand-aloneness of the idea. For what the idea should imply here is the discourse at large. The failure of passage is really a wanting of passage, but not to this or that case, or this or that equivalent, and at best approximate term, but to any possible approximation. The value of the idea is in how it can be used in a discourse, and that silence, or impasse, we call aporia, is discursive, articulate, or critical silence, anticipating a case to eventually subordinate to the criteria of some idea. The aporetic apotheosis of the Platonic dialogue is wrongly understood if understood as meaning uncertainty in an inclusive and defeatist sense. And this is actually the same problem we confront in large language models and even quantum mechanics. The exception is that in those areas it's remedied with probability. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, in our interpretation, is a physics variant of the Platonic aporia. It is not so much a perplexity if carefully thought through, but an indication that we've reached the most foundational layer of our epistemological approach. A condition we always presuppose and never consciously start our analysis with, but which is revealed to us at the end. The true purpose of this newfound awareness of our limitation is to reverse the original scheme. The uncertainty or aporia is now to be the vehicle by which analysis is performed. This is what we called explication earlier. Unusual and formulated this way, but it's a commonplace, something we do all the time. Recall how Aristotle's investigations always start with a general classification of the domain of analysis. Here is built a database of forms, classes, categories, groups and subgroups, divisions and subdivisions. A thoroughgoing mapping of the subject. If asked why we should approach our subject this way, you may reply, rhetorically, well, how else can one do it? Which is precisely the question which this query is meant to raise, a question indicative of aporia, because it evokes doubt as to the ontological validity of our epistemic approach. This classificational approach breaks down at certain, particularly abstract levels. It graduates into a Russellian paradox, a Bradleian regress, or an Eleatic loop. and it becomes evident that a different approach must be taken. The classificational approach, when approached merely as a certain method, then shows what classification is for. We want to map our domain of study in order to set up the conditions for a unifying thesis. What this thesis is simply the exposition of the underlying abstract individual, the individual to which all classifications are reduced. And this, by the way, is merely a rendition of the atomic concept, but in category theory.
Too abstract, man. How about a solid example? Consider zinc, silver, gold, and copper, different types of metal. What makes them metals is that they share the same set of properties: malleability, conductivity, crystal lattice structure, electron mobility, and so on. What makes them different is that they possess these properties at different intensities. We can imagine a control panel that allows us to derive all metals simply by adjusting electron mobility here and reducing conductivity there. We find that every modification to one property directly affects the others. For instance, increasing malleability typically decreases hardness, while increasing strength reduces ductility. Yet every stable configuration we observe, where specifically adjusted property rates balance each other out, gives us a recognizable metal. Thus, we can say that each type of metal is simply a unique profile, detailing the specific intensities at which all core metallic properties stabilize together. We clearly see that metal is the property space itself, governed by specific relational rules where properties interact in predictable ways. This implies a Pareto frontier inherent within the metallic structure, and every type of metal represents a Pareto-efficient solution within this possibility space. Pretty elegant system, isn't it?
So when we classify metals, we're really mapping the solution space of an optimization problem constrained by the laws of physics and chemistry. Each element is nature's answer to what's the best configuration given these particular priorities. What we've done here is that we've taken the problem of aporia and turned it into an index for a systematic approach. Think about how Heisenberg's uncertainty principle was spurred by the mathematical analysis he had immersed himself.
I remember discussions with Bohr which went through many hours till very late at night and ended almost in despair. And when at the end of the discussion I went alone for a walk in the neighboring park, I repeated to myself again and again the question: can nature possibly be so absurd as it seemed to us in these atomic experiments? When the first term seemed to accord with the energy principle, I became rather excited, and I began to make countless arithmetical errors. As a result, it was almost 3 o'clock in the morning before the final result of my computations lay before me. The energy principle had held for all terms, and I could no longer doubt that mathematical consistency and coherence of the kind of quantum mechanics to which my calculations pointed. I had the feeling that, through the surface of atomic phenomena, I was looking at a strangely beautiful interior, and I felt almost giddy at the thought that I now had to probe this wealth of mathematical structures nature had so generously spread out before me. I was far too excited to sleep, and so, as a new day dawned, I made for the southern tip of the island, where I had been longing to climb a rock jutting out into the sea. I now did so without too much trouble, and waited for the sun to rise.
We reach the same conclusion, that is, of uncertainty, when we see that metal, in itself, is only something which experience gives us. And in experience, we don't really see metal, for metal here is an abstract individual. Rather, we get something that represents metal. It's true that metal consists of general properties, but even those properties are instantiations of it. And when our attention falls upon any one of those properties, we can think of it as a compression of the whole property space we call metal, so that we're seeing our choice property by way of the whole system. We can infer from this that determining, say, conductivity is a determination of the phenomenon of metal through that metal or metals whose structure is optimized for high conductivity. Think silver or copper. And remember here that in this configurational space we're dealing with the general properties of metal, with metal alone. There's no silver or copper or gold, but only a kind of Pareto distribution of facilities. Each stable configuration of this space then becomes what we recognize as specific metals. And each one of these metals is only a configurational property of metal, or a Pareto solution for some underlying or fundamental inequality inherent within the system of metal. In the Platonic dialogues, the conclusion of the dialogue is that the proof is in the pudding. The meaning of justice is the actual process of interrogating justice. Ironic as that sounds. The meaning is the process of finding the meaning. Just as a mathematical operator is meaningless in itself unless some example of its use is shown. Similarly, we can't know what justice is unless we see a legal application. Certainly here, one may agree or disagree with the correctness or exactness of application, but that really only shows that there is some ideal as to how it should be used. Precisely the sensibility we find in mathematics, where only measurement counts, and at whose summit things like the uncertainty principle and the continuity hypothesis rear their head. And this is what in a different circumstance we'd call aporia. If anything, it shows that the Socratic method is inherently mathematical. If by mathematical we mean to approximate, to approach, which in mathematics is known as analysis. Now think of that intuition or aesthetic sense, where we know what we want to say, but lack the words. That is exactly the sense that we have when pondering over the exactness or inexactness of application. The appropriateness or felicity or correctness of use. The critical tendency and reflection that develops in those cases is the same aporia, but an aporia in which meaning is latent, i.e. acknowledgement, but whose perfect concretion is wanting or pending. In Baldwin's terms, the control sphere in which predication occurs is vacant and always is, unless some example recognized to be only proximate is given. Think of Descartes' well-known maxim, "I think, therefore I am." Only think of it as the same attitude of the word whose meaning you're trying to obtain. As you see, the more critical we grow in our approach to language, the more mathematical it tends to be. Hence the emphasis on function words. The utility of Peirce's semiotics lies here in our description of the relation between implication, the sense-yielding but wordless idea, and how significance is developed from and around it. Those are operations which Peirce's semiotic science attempts to formalize, and is what George Steiner discerningly dubs as a further translatory dimension through which a word must pass before it becomes meaningful. Now, what's the implication of this? It means that there's a framework that mediates grammar and content that links them, and that it's by comprehending this framework that we can actually properly apply the language in question. In other words, I must learn and grasp the semiotics of, say, the Arabic language in order to understand Arabic as an Arab might. If dreaming or thinking in a particular language means that you've become fluent in it, then imagine having a formula, the acquaintance with which allows you to think in that language without knowing much else of the language. Because in this case, you can use the formula as a square root of any possible idea. That is, understand some idea, any idea, by the rules which the formula prescribes. The formula being the definite article, or some language device that serves the same function.